Welcome to AMA Victoria. My name is Grant Forsyth. I'm the OIR advisor for doctors in training. We're going to go through a series of videos highlighting the changes that have been made to the new doctors in training agreement. There has been an improvement to the overtime clause, which separates the overtime clause from the hours of work clause. This will stop the averaging of overtime that is done in some hospitals. So now a doctor is entitled to be paid overtime on hours they work per week. So if you work 45 hours in 1 week and you're a registrar, then you should be paid 2 hours overtime for that week. It can no longer be averaged over any longer time than that. As you may know, AMA's had a claim to increase the minimum terms of doctor in training agreements to 2 years. Unfortunately, we're unable to get this across the line during negotiations, but there is an agreement that during the life of the next 4 years, which is the life of the agreement, we will be working with the hospitals and the VHIA, which is their representative, to introduce 2-year contracts where we possibly can. We've also changed the location allowance clause. It is now a requirement for a doctor to be paid the allowance if they are having to relocate more than 50 kilometres from their place of residence. We have introduced a new dispute resolution clause. This is a significant change to the agreement, and it is a modernisation of the agreement. It now will make it much clearer and much simpler on how a doctor should go about raising an issue with their hospital, and make it easier for AMA to enforce the various clauses of this. There is a significant change to the training time for registrars in this new agreement. Although we have not changed the quantum that doctors are entitled to, we have strengthened the clause significantly and brought it into the agreement and away from the definitions as it was in the old agreement. This new clause makes it much clearer the process that a hospital has to go through to allocate training time, what training time is, and how they have to engage with the registrars at the start of their rotations or their employment to agree to what training time is and how it's defined. Also, there is a process now for what happens if you don't get access to the training time, and how much you should be paid in compensation if you don't get access to it. There is also the ability for the hospital and the doctor to agree to accumulate that leave. So maybe for a doctor it suits them better to do 10 hours a fortnight rather than 5 hours a week. So with the agreement of with the hospital and the doctor, this training time can now be lumped into a bigger section, and this may make it easier for the hospitals to roster this training time. Also, it is clear now in the agreement that what a roster is and where the roster needs to be kept and who should have access to that roster. In the past, we've had issues because training time was not in the roster, or if it was in the roster, not everybody who needed to know about where a doctor is was aware of that, so may have been continuing to call. For example, reception staff, nursing staff, or other doctors within the hospital. So in order to stop doctors being paged while they're supposed to be at training, we've asked that we've clarified what a roster is and where it should be kept. We've also included an internal training clause. This means that where a doctor has compulsory training that the hospital requires them to complete for their to be able to work in that hospital, this must be done within the doctor's normal working hours, and they must be paid for it. There have been a number of changes to the hours of work clause. These include a restriction of 16 hours maximum per day for registrars, 48 hours break between night shift and day shift, so coming from a night shift to a day shift. A restriction of the number of night shifts a doctor can work in a row of 7. Just to clarify, there is no restriction on being able to work 7 days on, 7 days off of in this new agreement. There has been some calls to the office asking whether this is still able to be done, and the answer to that is yes. Under this agreement you will be able to work 7 days on, 7 days off. Under the new agreement there is now a clarification of what is meant by a 10-hour break, and you'll see in the agreement that there are examples now. We haven't changed the wording of the clause, but we have clarified through the examples what is meant by a 10-hour break. This means that a doctor who is on call or overnight, if they make a call or get interrupted during that night, they are still entitled to an uninterrupted break between their shifts. So if you take a call in the middle of the night and you haven't been able to have a 10-hour break in that time, you will be entitled to not go to work until you've received that 10-hour break, and you should not lose any of your pay for that next day. There is also a new workload management clause. This sets out how a doctor or doctors will be able to raise concerns with workload in their department or their health service, and this will allow AMA to be involved in this process, but it sets out what needs to happen in order to get a review of staffing in your department or your hospital. The agreement now sets out that a doctor must be replaced when on annual leave, and it also makes it clear that it is not the doctor's responsibility, once a leave has been approved, to find replacements for either their shifts or any on-call work that they are scheduled to do during that time. This clause now makes it clear that it is a doctor's right to request leave at a time of their choosing, and it also sets out the process of doing so and the process that needs to be followed if for any reason the hospital declines that request. So that concludes the overview of the changes that were made to the agreement. We intend to do a series of videos that will go in more depth into some of the more important changes and give you an understanding of how significant these changes are and how they will impact you and your work. Thanks very much.